Okay, we're good. Alrighty, I'm going to read. I'm going to aim for 30 minutes again, as usual. Here's the book, Kokoro by Natsume Soseki. Chapter 54. The doctor had appeared in the sick room and was giving my father another enema in an attempt to ease his discomfort. The nurse, who had stayed up with him all night, was asleep in another room. Unused to such scenes, my brother was standing there looking unnerved. "Lend us a hand here," he said, when he saw me, and sat down again. I took his place by the bedside, helping out by holding the piece of oiled paper under my father's buttocks. My father began to look a little more comfortable. The doctor stayed with him for about half an hour and checked the results of the enema, then left, saying he'd be back. As he was on his way out, he made a point of telling us we should call him at any time if something untoward occurred. Even though something seemed likely to happen at any moment, I left the fraught atmosphere of the sick room to make another attempt to read Sensei's letter. But I was quite unable to compose myself and give the words my attention. As soon as I was settled at my desk, I fully expected my brother to call out for me again, and my hand holding the letter shook with fear that this time it really would be the end. I flipped abstractedly through the pages, my eyes taking in the careful script that filled the little squares of the manuscript paper, but completely unable to concentrate enough to read it. I could barely even skim it for a general sense of what was written. I went through page after page until I reached the last, then began to fold them up to leave on the desk. As I did so, a couple of lines near the close of the letter caught my eye. "When this letter reaches your hands, I will no longer be in this world. I will be long dead." I caught my heart. Nope. I caught my breath. My heart, until that moment agitated and distracted, instantly froze. I ran my eyes hastily back through the letter from the end, picking up a sentence here or there on each page. My eyes attempted to pierce the flickering words passing in front of them, in a desperate attempt to gain an understanding. All I wanted was reassurance that Sensei was safe. His past, that vague past that he had promised to explain, was completely beside the point in my present state of urgent need. At length, having run through the letter backward, I gave up and folded the pages, infuriated by this long letter that refused to give me the information I sought. I returned to the doorway of the sick room to check on my father's condition. All was unusually quiet around him. I beckoned to my mother, who was sitting there looking faint from weariness, and asked how he was. "He seemed unchanged for the moment," she replied. I lowered my head to his face and asked, "How are you? Was the enema any help?" My father nodded. "Thanks," he said in a clear voice. His mind seemed surprisingly lucid. Retreating to my room once more, I checked the clock against the train timetable. Suddenly I stood, tightened my kimono belt, and thrust Sensei's letter into my sleeve. I went out through the back door. Frantically, I ran to the doctor's house. I had to ask him to tell me plainly whether my father would survive a few more days, to beg him to use injections or some means to keep him alive a little longer. Unfortunately, the doctor was out. I had neither the time nor the patience to await his return. I climbed into a rickshaw and hurried on to the station. Once there, I penciled a letter to my mother and brother, holding the page against the station wall. It was very brief, but I judged it was better than simply running off without apology or explanation. So I gave it to the rickshaw man and asked him to hurry and deliver it. Then, with the vigor of decision, I leaped onto the Tokyo-bound train. Seated in the thundering third-class carriage, I retrieved Sensei's letter from my sleeve and at last read it from beginning to end. Okay, so we are now on the last part, and I guess this part is a little bit longer because it's still like about half of this book. This is part 3, Sensei's Testament. Chapter 55. I have had 2 or 3 letters from you this summer. I seemed to remember that in the second or third, you asked my aid in securing a suitable position. When I read this, I had the impulse to help in some way. At the very least, I should have replied, and I felt bad that I did not. But I must confess that I made absolutely no effort in response to your request. Living, as you know, not so much in a confined social milieu as entirely cut off from the social world, I simply had no means of doing so. But this was not my real problem. Truth to tell, I was just then struggling with the question of what to do about myself. Should I continue as I was, like a walking mummy doomed to remain in the human world, or... But whenever I whispered in my heart this, or, a horror overcame me. I was like a man who rushes to the edge of a cliff and suddenly finds himself gazing down into a bottomless chasm. I was a coward, suffering precisely the agony that all cowards suffer. Sorry as I am to admit it, the simple truth is that your existence was the last thing on my mind. Indeed, to put it bluntly, the question of your work, of how you should earn a living, was utterly meaningless to me. I didn't care. It was the least of my problems. I left your letter in the letter rack, folded my arms, and returned to my thoughts. Far from feeling sympathetic, I did no more than cast a bitter glance your way. A fellow from a family with a decent amount of property, only just graduated, and already making a fuss about a job. I confess this to you now by way of explanation for my unforgivable failure to respond. I am not being intentionally rude to stir your anger. I believe that as you read on, you will fully understand. At all events, I neglected to reply as I should have done, and now I apologize for my remissness. Afterward, I sent you a telegram. In truth, I rather wanted to see you just then. I wanted to tell you the story of my past, as you had asked. When you replied that you could not come to Tokyo, I sat for a long time gazing at the telegram in disappointment. You must have felt that your brief response was not enough, for you then wrote me that long letter from which I understood the circumstances that held you at home. I have no cause to consider you rude. How come you have left your dear sick father at home and come? Indeed, it was wrong of me to have summoned you so high-handedly. Ignoring the problem of your father's health, I had forgotten about him when I sent that telegram, I must admit. This despite the fact that I was the one who so earnestly advised you to take good care of him and emphasized how dangerous his illness was. I am an inconsistent creature. Perhaps it is the pressure of my past and not my own perverse mind that has made me into this contradictory being. I am all too well aware of this fault in myself. You must forgive me. When I read your letter, the last letter you wrote, I realized I had done wrong. I thought of writing to that effect, but I took up my pen, then laid it down again without writing a line. If I were to write to you, it must be this letter, you see. and the time for that had not yet quite come. That is why I sent the simple telegram saying you need not come. Chapter 56. I then began to write this letter. Being unaccustomed to writing, I have agonized over the difficulty of describing my thoughts and experiences precisely as I wanted. Time and again, I almost reached the point of giving up and abandoning the effort to fulfill my promise to you. But it was useless to put down the pen and decide to stop. Within an hour, the urge to write would return. You may well attribute this simply to my nature, as someone who is meticulous about promises and obligations. I don't deny it. Being, as you know, quite isolated from human intercourse, I have not a single truly binding obligation in my life. Whether intentionally or by nature, I have lived so as to keep such ties to an absolute minimum. Not that I am indifferent to the obligation. No, I spend my days so passively because of my very sensitivity to such things. I lack the energy to withstand the toll they take on my nerves. And so once I make a promise, it distresses me deeply if I do not fulfill it. It is partly in order to avoid being distressed on account of you that I must keep taking up the pen. Besides, I want to write. I want to write about my past, quite aside from the obligation involved. My past is my own experience. One might call it my personal property. And perhaps, being property, it could be thought a pity not to pass it on to someone else before I die. This is certainly more or less how I feel about it, but I would rather that my experience be buried with me than be passed to someone incapable of receiving it. In truth, if you did not exist, my past would have remained just that. It would not become someone else's knowledge even at second hand. Among the many millions of Japanese, it is to you alone that I want to tell the story of my past. Because you are sincere, you are serious in your desire to learn real lessons from life. I will not hesitate to cast upon you the shadow thrown by the darkness of human life, but do not be afraid. Gaze steadfastly into this darkness and find there the things that will be of use to you. The darkness of which I speak is a moral darkness. I was born a moral man and raised as one. My morality is probably very different from that of young people today. But different though it may be, it is my own. It is not some rented clothing I have borrowed to suit the moment. This is why I believe it will be some of use to you, a young man just starting out in life. You and I have often argued over questions of modern thought, as I'm sure you remember. You well understand my own position on such things, I'm sure. I never felt outright contempt for your opinions, yet I could not bring myself to actually respect them. Nothing lay behind your ideas. You were too young to have had your own experience. Sometimes I smiled. At times I glimpsed dissatisfaction on your face. Meanwhile, you were also pressing me to unroll my past before you like some painted scroll. This was the first time I actually privately respected you. You revealed a shameless determination to see something really alive from within my very being. You were prepared to rip open my heart and drink at its warm fountain of blood. I was still alive then. I did not want to die. And so I evaded your urgings and promised to do so, and promised to do as you asked another day. Now I will wrench open my heart and pour its blood over you. I will be satisfied if, when my own heart has ceased to beat, your breast houses new life. Your breast houses new life? What? Chapter 57. I was not yet 20 when I lost both my parents. My wife told you, I remember, that they died of the same illness. You were astonished when she said they died at virtually the same time. The fact is that my father contracted the dreaded typhoid fever, and my mother became infected through nursing him. I was their only son. The family was quite wealthy, so I was brought up in considerable comfort. Looking back, I now think that if my parents had not died when they did, if one of them, it does not matter which, had continued to be there to support me, I would have remained as generous and easygoing as I was in those days. Their deaths left me stunned and helpless. I had no knowledge, no experience, no wisdom. My mother had been too ill to be with my father when he died. She did not even learn of his death before she died herself. I have no idea whether she intuited it or whether she believed that those around her told her that he was on the road to recovery. She left everything in the hands of my uncle. I was at her bedside with him when she indicated me and begged him to look after me. I had already gained my parents' permission to go up to Tokyo, and she evidently intended to tell him so. But she had only got as far as saying, "He'll go too," when my uncle broke in with, "Very good, you have no need to worry." He turned to me and said, "Your mother's a fine, strong woman." Perhaps he was referring to how well she was coping with the throes of fever. Looking back on it now, though, it is hard to say whether those words of hers, in fact, constituted a kind of last will. She was, of course, aware of the identity of the terrible illness my father had contracted, and knew she had also been infected by it. But did she understand that she too was dying? It is impossible to say. And no matter how lucidly and sensibly she spoke in her fevered states, she often would have no memory of it later. So perhaps, but I must stick to the point. The fact is that I had already developed the habit of taking nothing at face value, but analyzing and turning things over obsessively in my mind. I should explain this to you before I proceed. The following anecdote, though not particularly relevant to my story, serves as a good example of this trait, so please read it in that light. For I feel my impulse to doubt the honorable nature of others' actions and behavior probably grew from this time. This has unquestionably much exacerbated my suffering and misery, and I want you to keep that in mind. But I must not confuse you by such digressions. Let me return to my tale. It's possible I am writing this long letter to you with a calmer heart than someone else in my position might. The rumble of streetcars, which disturbs the night once the world is sleeping, has now ceased. Beyond the doors, the faint, touching song of a little cricket has begun, subtly evoking the transient dews of autumn. My innocent wife is sleeping soundly and unaware in the next room. My pen moves over the page, the sound of its tip registering each word and stroke. It is with a tranquil heart that I sit here before the page. My hand may slip from lack of practice, but I do not believe my clumsy writing derives from an agitated mind. Chapter 58. Left alone in the world as I was, I could only do as my mother said, and throw myself on my uncle's mercy. For his part, he took over all responsibilities and saw to my needs. He also arranged for me to go to Tokyo as I wished. I came to Tokyo and entered the college here. College students in those days were far wilder and rougher than they are today. One boy I knew, for instance, got into an argument with a working man one night and struck him with his wooden clog, leaving a gash in his head. He had been drinking. As they fought, the man seized the boy's school cap and made off with it. His name, of course, was clearly printed on a white cloth patch inside the cap. This all produced such a ruckus that the police threatened to report the matter to the school, but luckily the boy's friends stepped in and managed to keep it out of the public eye. No doubt, tales of this sort of wild behavior must sound utterly foolish to someone of your generation, brought up in more refined times. I find it foolish myself, but students in those days did at least have a touching simplicity that present-day students lack. The monthly allowance my uncle sent me was far smaller than the amount you now receive from your father. Of course, things were cheaper then, I suppose, yet I never felt the slightest lack. Furthermore, I was never in the unfortunate position of having to envy the financial good fortune of any other classmate. More likely, they envied me, I realize now. Besides my fixed monthly allowance, I also applied to my uncle quite often for money for books. Even as a student, I enjoyed buying books and other incidental expenses, and I was able to use this money just as I liked. Innocent that I was, I trusted my uncle completely. Indeed, I felt grateful respect for him. He was an entrepreneur and had been a member of the prefectural government. No doubt, this was behind the connection with one of the political parties that I also recall. He was my father's full brother, but they seemed to have developed very different characters. My father was a true gentleman and managed his inheritance with great diligence. He enjoyed elegant traditional pursuits, such as flower arranging and ceremonial tea-making, and reading books of poetry. I believe he had quite an interest in antique books and such things as well. Our house was in the country, about 5 miles from town, where my uncle lived. The antiques dealer in town would sometimes come all the way out to show my father scrolls, incense holders, and so on. The English expression, a man of means, probably sums up my father. He was a country gentleman of somewhat cultivated tastes. He and my bustling, worldly uncle were thus of very different temperaments, yet they were oddly close. My father would often praise him as a professional man, much more capable and reliable than himself. People in his own position who inherit their wealth, often find, he told me, that their native abilities lose their edge. His problem was he had no need to fight his way in the world. My father said this both to my mother and to me, but his words seemed specifically for my benefit. He fixed his gaze on me and said, "You'd better remember that." I did as I was told, and remember his words to this day. How could I have doubted my uncle's integrity then, when my father had praised him so highly and trusted him so thoroughly? I would have been proud of him even had my parents lived. Now that they were dead and I was left entirely in his care, it was no longer simple pride I felt. My uncle had become essential for my survival. Chapter 59. The first time I returned from Tokyo for the summer holidays, my uncle and aunt had moved into the house where I had suffered through the death of my parents, and were now ensconced there. This had been decided on before I left for Tokyo. It was the only thing to be done, since I was the only remaining person in our family, and no longer living there myself. My uncle, I recall, was involved with a number of companies in the town at the time. When we were discussing how to arrange things so that I would be free to go to Tokyo, he had remarked half-jokingly that it would actually be more convenient for him to stay in his home in town to attend to his work, rather than move out to this house 5 miles away. My family home was an old and important one in the area, fairly well known to the local people. As you probably know, to demolish or sell an old house with a history when there is an heir who could live there is a serious matter. Nowadays, I would not let such things bother me, but I was still essentially a child. The problem of leaving the house empty while I was living in Tokyo was a great worry for me. My uncle grudgingly agreed to move into the empty house that now belonged to me, but he insisted he would need to keep his house in town and move to and from between the two as need arose. I was, of course, in no position to object. I was happy to accept any conditions as long as I could get to Tokyo. Child that I still was, I looked back with a warm nostalgia on the house I had now left. I felt about it as a traveler feels about the home to which he will one day return. For all that I had longed to leave it for Tokyo, I had a strong compulsion to go back there when the summer holidays came. And I often had dreams of the house I would return to after the hard study and fun of the term were over. I do not know just how my uncle divided his time between the two places while I was away, but when I arrived in the summer, the whole family was gathered there under a single roof. I imagine that the children were there for the holidays, although they would have lived in town for most of the year to attend school. Everyone was delighted to see me, and I was happy to find the house so much livelier and more cheerful than it had been in my parents' day. My uncle moved his eldest son out of the room that had been mine so that I could occupy it again. There were quite enough rooms to go around, and at first I demurred, saying I didn't mind where I slept. But he would not hear of it. "It's your house," he told me. Recollections of my dead mother and father were all that disturbed the pleasure of the summer I spent with my uncle's family before returning to Tokyo. But one event did cast a faint shadow across my heart. Although I had barely begun my college life, my uncle and aunt both urged me to consider marrying. They must have repeated it 3 or 4 times. The first time they brought up the subject, it was so unexpected that I was no more than taken aback. The second time, I made my refusal clear. When they brought it up a third time, I was forced to ask their reasons for pressing marriage on me in this way. Their answer was brief and straightforward. They simply wanted me to make an early marriage so that I could come back to live in the house and become my father's heir. Personally, all I wanted to do was come back during the vacations. I was familiar enough with country ways to understand the talk of succeeding my father and the consequent need for a wife, of course. And I was not even really against the idea. But I had only just gone to Tokyo to pursue my studies, and to me it was all in some distant future landscape, seen as it were through a telescope. I left the house without consenting to my uncle's wish. Alright, this will be my last chapter. Chapter 60. I forgot all about this talk of marriage. None of the young fellows around me, after all, had the air of responsible householders. All seemed their own men, individual and free of constraints. If I had penetrated below the apparent happiness, I might have found some whom family circumstance had already forced to marry. But I was too young and innocent to be aware of such things. Besides, anyone who found himself in that kind of situation would have kept it to himself as far as possible, considering it private and quite irrelevant to a student's life. I now realize that I was already in this category myself, but in my innocence, I continued to pursue my studies contentedly. At the end of the school year, I once more packed my trunk and returned to the home that held my parents' graves. Once again, I found my uncle and aunt and their children in the house where my parents used to live. Nothing had changed. I breathed again the familiar scent of my home, a scent still filled with nostalgic memories. Needless to say, I also welcomed being back there as a relief from the monotony of the year's studies. But even as I breathed the scent, so redolent of the air I had grown up in, my uncle suddenly thrust the question of marriage under my nose again. He repeated his line from my previous visit, giving the same reason as before. But while the summer before he had no particular woman in mind, this time I was disconcerted to learn that a prospective wife had been selected for me. She was my uncle's daughter. In other words, my own cousin. Marrying her would suit both of us, he maintained, and furthermore, my father had actually spoken of it before he died. Put this way, I supposed it was a suitable enough arrangement, and I easily accepted that my father could have had that conversation with my uncle. I was certainly rather surprised, since this was the first time I had heard of it. My uncle's request seemed perfectly reasonable and comprehensible, however. No doubt I should not have taken his words on faith, but what primarily concerned me was that I felt quite indifferent to this younger daughter of mine. But what primarily concerned me was that I felt quite indifferent to this younger daughter of my uncle. We'd been close ever since childhood, when I had been a constant visitor at my uncle's house in town, not only on day visits, but also as an overnight guest. As you will know, romantic love never develops between siblings. I may be stretching the interpretation of this well-known fact, but it seems to me that between any male and female who have been close and in continual contact, such great intimacy rules out the fresh response necessary to stimulate feelings of romantic love. Just as you can only really smell incense in the first moments after it is lit, or taste wine in that instant of the first sip, the impulse of love springs from a single, perilous moment in time, I feel. If this moment slips casually by unnoticed, intimacy may grow as the two become accustomed to each other, but the impulse to romantic love will be numbed. And so, consider it as I might, I could not find it in me to marry my cousin. My uncle said that if I wanted, I could put off the marriage until after my graduation. But, he went on, we should seize the day, as the saying goes, and perform the basic exchange of marriage cups as soon as possible. The question of when it should happen was of no concern to me, since I felt no interest in the bride. I reiterated my refusal. My uncle looked unsatisfied, and my cousin wept. Hers were not tears of regret that she could not take place. Hers were not tears of regret that she could not take her place beside me. They were the tears of a humiliated woman who had sought marriage and had been rejected. I knew perfectly well that she loved me as little as I loved her. I went back to Tokyo. A year later, at the Chapter 61. A year later, at the beginning of the following summer, I went back home for the third time. As always, I couldn't wait to finish final exams and get out of Tokyo, which indicates how much I longed for my home. I am sure you know this well too. The very color of the air in the place I was born was different. The smell of the earth was special, redolent with memories of my parents. To spend July and August nestled back inside that world, motionless as a snake in its hole, filled me with warm pleasure. My innocent and uncomplicated mind felt no need to bother itself much over the problem of the proposed marriage to my cousin. If you didn't want to do something, you simply said no, I believed, and there would be no further repercussions. So although I had not submitted to my uncle's will, I remained unperturbed. I returned home in my usual high spirits, after a year spent unworried by the question. But when I got home, I discovered that my uncle's attitude had changed. He did not embrace me with a welcoming smile as he had before. For the first 4 or 5 days, I remained unaware of the change. My loving upbringing had not prepared me to even recognize the coldness. Finally, however, some chance event finally brought it to my notice. I then realized in bewilderment that it was not only my uncle who had changed, but also my aunt. My cousin was also odd, and so was my uncle's son, who had earlier written a friendly letter asking me to investigate the industrial college he intended to enter in Tokyo once he had graduated from middle school. Being who I am, I puzzled over this development. Why had my feelings changed? Or rather, why had theirs changed? Then it occurred to me that perhaps my dead parents had suddenly cleansed my dulled eyes and given me a clear vision of the world. Deep inside, you see, I felt that my parents continued to love me as in life. Even though I was already well acquainted with the real world by then, the strong superstitious beliefs of my ancestors coursed deep in my blood. No doubt they still do. I climbed the nearby hill alone and knelt before my parents' graves, half in mourning and half in gratitude. I prayed to them to watch over me, feeling as I prayed that my future happiness lay in those hands, buried beneath the cold stone. You may laugh, and no, I deserve it, but that is who I was. In a flash, my whole world changed. This was not, mind you, my first such experience. When I was 16 or 17, my sudden discovery of beauty in the world had stunned me. Many times I rubbed my eyes in sheer disbelief and doubted my own eyes, while my heart exclaimed, "Ah, how beautiful!" At that age, boys and girls alike attain what is commonly called sensuality. In this new state, I was for the first time able to see woman as representative of the beauty that the world contains. My eyes, until then quite blind to this beauty in the opposite sex, sprang upon, and from that moment my universe was transformed. It was with precisely the same sort of shock that I became conscious of the change in my uncle's attitude to me. I was stunned by the realization, which came upon me abruptly, without any premonition. Suddenly, my uncle and his family seemed to me completely different creatures. I was haunted by the feeling that I must make some move, or who knew what might befall me. Hi, Touchy. Good morning to you. Okay, Chapter 62. I decided that I owed it to my dead parents to obtain a detailed understanding of the house and property that I had until then left for my uncle to look after. My uncle presented himself as living a hectic life. He bustled endlessly between the townhouse and the country estate, spending perhaps 1 in 3 nights in town. Forever on the move, he made a great fuss about how busy he was. I had always taken him at his word, although I sometimes cynically suspected that he was following the modern fashion to appear busy. But now, with my newfound desire to find a new But now, with my newfound desire to find a time to talk through the question of property, I could only interpret this endless rush as an excuse to avoid me. I never had a chance to pin him down. A friend from my middle school days told me that my uncle kept a mistress in town. Knowing the sort of man he was, I had no reason to doubt that he might have a mistress, but I had no memory of such talk while my father was alive, so the rumor startled me. The friend also passed on to me various other rumors that were circulating about my uncle. Among them was the story that his business had been generally thought to be going under, but in the last 2 or 3 years it had suddenly revived and prospered. This tale heightened my own suspicions. I finally managed to open negotiations with my uncle. Perhaps the word negotiations is a little harsh, but as we talked, the tenor of our relations sank to such a low level that only this word can express what took place. My uncle persisted in treating me as a child, while I viewed him through the jaundiced eyes of suspicion. Under these circumstances, the chances of a peaceful resolution were nil. Unfortunately, my need to press on with my story prevents me from describing the details of those negotiations for you. To tell the truth, there is another, more important matter I have yet to speak of, one that I have with difficulty restrained my pen from writing all this time. I have lost forever the chance to talk quietly with you, and now I am also forced to admit some of what I would like to write, not only because I lack the skill to express myself on the page, but also because time is precious to me. You may remember I once said to you that no one is inherently bad by nature, and I warned you to be careful because most honest folk will suddenly turn bad when circumstances prompt it. You warned me I was becoming excited and upset, and you asked me what kind of circumstances provoked good people to become wicked. When I answered with the single word money, you looked dissatisfied. I well remember that look. I can reveal to you now that I was thinking at that moment of my uncle. I was thinking of him with hatred, as an example of an ordinary, decent person who will suddenly turn bad when he sees money. And I was thinking of the fact that no one in this world is to be trusted. Probably my reply dissatisfied you because you were bent on seeing things in terms of philosophical questions, and you found my answer trite, but I spoke from experience. I was upset at the time, I agree, but I believe that a commonplace idea, stated with passionate conviction, carries more living truth than some novel observation expressed with cool indifference. It is the force of blood that drives my body after all. Words are not just vibrations in the air, they work more powerfully than that on more powerful objects. Chapter 63. All right, I think this is going to be my last chapter, actually. I'm getting kind of hungry. Chapter 63. To put it simply, my uncle cheated me out of my inheritance. He did it with ease during the 3 years that I spent in Tokyo. From a worldly perspective, I was an absolute fool to have left everything in my uncle's hands without a thought. From some more elevated viewpoint, perhaps I could be admired as pure and innocent. But when I look back on that self now, I wonder why I should have been born so innocent, and that foolish Sorry, I gotta look this word up.
Credulity. Credulity.
But when I look back on that now, I wonder why I should have been born so innocent, and that foolish credulity makes me grind my teeth. And yet, I also long to be once again that person who still retained his first innate purity. Bear in mind that the sensei you know is a man who has been sullied by the world. If we define our betters as those who have spent more years being tarnished by the dirt of the world, then I can certainly claim to be your better. Would I have been materially better off if I had married my cousin, as my uncle wanted? The answer is clear, I think. But the fact is, my uncle was scheming to force his daughter on me. He wasn't offering me this marriage out of some kindly intended idea of how well it would suit both sides of the family. No. What drove him was the baser motive of personal profit. I did not love my cousin, but nor did I dislike her. Still, thinking back on it now, I can see it gave me a certain degree of pleasure to refuse her. Of course, my refusal did not alter the basic fact that he was cheating me, but at least as the victim, I had the satisfaction of standing up for myself a little. I wasn't letting him entirely have his way. This point is so trivial, however, that it is hardly worth bothering over. To your outsider's point of view, it must seem like nothing more than foolishly stubborn pride. Other relatives stepped in to mediate between us. They were people I did not trust at all. Indeed, I felt quite hostile toward them. Having discovered my uncle's treachery, I was convinced that others must be equally treacherous. After all, my reasoning went, if the man my father had praised so highly could behave like this, what could one expect of others? Nevertheless, these relatives sorted out for me everything that pertained to my inheritance. Its cash value came to a great deal less than I had anticipated. I had only two options: to accept this accounting without complaint, or to take my uncle to court. I was angry and I was confused. If I sued him, I feared the case might continue for a long time before it was settled. It also seemed to me that it would cause me added difficulties by taking precious time away from the studies I was still pursuing. After thinking it through, I went to an old school friend in the town and arranged to have everything I had received converted to cash. My friend advised me against the plan, but I refused to listen to him. I had decided to leave my native home forever. I vowed that I would never lay eyes on my uncle again. Before I left, I paid a final visit to my parents' graves. I have not seen it since, and now I never will. My friend disposed of everything as I had asked. Naturally, it took some time after my return to Tokyo to finalize it all. Selling farmland in the country is no easy matter, and I had to be careful lest others take advantage of me. So in the end, I settled for a lot less than the market price. To be honest, my assets amounted to the few government bonds I had in my pocket when I left home, and the money my friend subsequently sent. Sadly, the inheritance my parents had left me was greatly diminished, and it felt all the worse because it was not profligacy on my part that had reduced it. Still, the proceeds were more than enough for me to survive on as a student. Indeed, I used less than half the interest from it. And it was this financial security that subsequently propelled me into an utterly unforeseen situation. Okay, that is a good stopping point for me. And also, I am super hungry, so I need to eat something before I go to sleep. But we made some good progress on the book. So I do plan to read tomorrow sometime Friday evening. Have a good night. Thank you, Tachi. I hope you have a good Friday. Alrighty. Goodbye.